Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 23 years of law enforcement analysis experience. She started her career with the Washington-Baltimore HIDA before moving back to Arizona and joining Scottsdale PD, where she's currently the Crime Analysis Supervisor. She's been part of many great IACA conference committees, and she's currently the IACA President. Please welcome Mary Bertuccelli. Mary, how are we doing?
Great. How are you?
I am doing well. So there's so much I want to get into. We're definitely going to be talking about IACA, but first I wanted to spend this first segment talking a little bit about your career because you started at the Washington-Baltimore HIDA. So talk a little bit about how you discovered the job at Washington-Baltimore HIDA and how you made it to the Washington-Baltimore HIDA.
I was going to school at the University of Maryland at College Park, and I got a research assistantship, and I started working with one of the professors at the HIDA on a grant called Break the Cycle. I did that for a couple of years, analyzing a lot of crime data relating to like drugs and sentencing. And then I ended up transitioning to a different grant called the Comment Study, where we did a lot of surveys with law enforcement, specialized task force and stuff like that to see what counter surveillance measures they were noticing were being used against them. Then there was a position that came open to do intelligence analysis. And so then I ended up working in Baltimore doing a lot of intelligence analysis, and they were trying to implement a CompStat process. So CompStat was brand new, and they had a commissioner, actually was a deputy commissioner at that time, who had come from New York and wanted to bring the whole CompStat model. And we worked with Jack Maple, who was one of the founders of CompStat from the NYPD.
Who was the deputy commissioner at the time?
Norris was the deputy commissioner, and then he became the commissioner.
Yeah, yes. So talk about some of the duties and some of the tasks that you did to support CompStat and support the police department.
Well, we worked on preparing a lot of the intelligence packets for the CompStat, like for the whole CompStat process. So we were assigned to different districts. Baltimore, as you know, is divided into 9 different districts, and I was in charge of that whole eastern side. So the northeastern, the eastern, the southeastern districts were mine. So we would be kind of analyzing and it was mostly violent crime that we were looking at there, analyzing the crimes and then trying to help with locating locating potential leads for the detectives, and then preparing everything for that. We had a weekly CompStat meeting.
So you're stationed there at Baltimore Police Department, not only as a civilian, but not actually part of the police department either. So kind of talk about the growing pains that you had fitting in and being able to be part of the team there at the office.
That's a good question. I came into it I tried to keep a really open mind and wanted to soak up everything that I could learn when I was there, because this was kind of a new thing for me. And we didn't have any formal training. They just kind of said, I think you could do this job. Do you think you can do this job? And I was like, yeah. And my interview with Baltimore PD was maybe about 10 minutes long. I went in, I met the deputy commissioner at that time, and he told me probably more about himself and what his vision was. And then said, like, when can you start? I was like, oh, I got to give 2 weeks notice. But I was really fortunate that I worked with Eric Conahia, was one of the other analysts, and he had worked for the Maryland State Patrol. So he'd been an officer and an undercover detective for a long time. And so he understood both the sworn operations and what the officers were dealing with in Baltimore. And then he understood more the analytical side of it too. So he was a really great teacher for me, and he taught me a lot of do's and don'ts. I'd never worked in a police environment. The officers themselves and the detectives that we worked with didn't necessarily trust us because we were coming in from an outside agency. We didn't belong to Baltimore PD, but we weren't a federal agency. And it was like they didn't really know what to make of us. So you really had to work hard to gain their trust. I just tried to meet as many people and network as much as I could and I asked a lot of questions. And I think people knew that I was genuinely curious about their job and how it worked and how that fit in with the rest of the department and all these different roles within the investigations units, the roles that they played in solving cases, because there was so much crime happening at that time. And so it was important to make sure that people trusted you. And so that took a while to kind of gain their trust. But once you did, it was a great job. It was a lot of fun. The crime was really interesting. And I really loved my time there.
Yeah, so that gets into your badge story, which is your career defining case or project that you work on. And that's dealing with gaining the trust of the folks in the office. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So at that time, they kept, like, the homicide unit was different from the shooting unit, was different from the drug unit. They were all separated. They were all on separate floors. Everyone was they worked in their own little silos, and they weren't really great about sharing information. And I went and I worked with a lot of different people. And so I was able to build relationships with a lot of the detectives and the detective sergeants that were in charge of these units. Their homicide, there's been a lot of like TV shows and movies made about Baltimore's homicide unit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of detectives that have worked there for a really long time. And they just, they're like, whatever, new people, new stuff. I'm not interested. But there was like one newer detective, and he had come to me at one point and said, hey, I really need help trying to find this guy. I was able to access some databases that I had gained from building relationships with some of the other units. And I was able to help him with that. Once he got him, he built this whole case and came back to me then and said, hey, I need you to build a link chart for me, like one of those things where you put everyone together and show it all, and so that I can explain this better. And I was like, okay, and I did that. And he had it up in his office over in his side of the building, which was really far from where we were. It was probably a couple months later, I felt like I knew I'd really made it, because the oldest, most tenured detective comes walking into, made this long trek from the homicide unit over to where we were stationed in a separate area building, said, hey, I think I need your help with something. I'd like you to make me one of those chart things like you did for Kevin. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. Tell me about your case. But inside I was like, woohoo.
Yeah.
I finally made progress. But one of the key things with that and how I was able to make those links and everything was that I had one day after Comstat, one of the drug sergeants had come up to me and he'd said, hey, Mary, I've got this database that I think you might be interested. We use it it's like a gang nickname database. And I was like, oh yeah, that'd be great. And so he hands me a disc and I'm like, I said, thanks a lot. And, really excited to see this and thank you. And I go back to my unit and I talk to my lieutenant and I'm like, hey, guess what I got? He's like, what? And I hold up this disc and I said, it's the nickname database. And he was like, oh, and his face, like,
that was Paul Harmon, right?
Yes, it was Lieutenant Herman. His face, gosh, it was priceless. His mouth, his jaw dropped, his mouth is open. He's like, oh my God, I've heard about the existence of it, but I wasn't sure if it was really true. And I'm like, well, let's go find out. So we put it in the computer and open it up, and it was this database, and you could query by like nickname or by an actual name, by height, weight, different descriptors in there. So it was a gold mine of data, because in Baltimore, as you would know, no one goes by their real name. Everyone has a nickname. If you queried in that nickname database Shorty, there'd be 40 Shorties, but they're all differentiated by what type of drugs they're selling and which side of the city that they're on. So when you had a shooting where there was a Shorty and it was over marijuana, like you could narrow the field down a lot by going through this database. So it was a gold mine. We were so excited to get that information. But that's all like just networking and trying to build those relationships so that people would be more free with information and more willing to work with you. So by getting that database, I was able to start, making a lot more connections and within our crimes and our crime series. And I was even able to convert the old trusty homicide detective to come and ask for some assistance. So that was a big win for me.
So with the idea that all these different departments aren't talking to one another, is this where Comstat really became valuable? Is it brought people together in the same meeting to talk about the different issues with the city?
I think it was definitely a learning curve, and the process changed a lot over time. And at one point when the deputy commissioner became the commissioner, he ended up sending several of us up to New York to watch their CompStat and how they did it. And that was a really impressive process. But it did get people kind of in the same room and hearing things, because a lot of them, they worked in their own little silos and they didn't get out much. And all of those cases were so interrelated, especially, there, and the type of crimes that they were seeing was all related to a lot of drug trafficking. It was important that your gang information people and your shootings and your homicides, because shooting is really just a failed homicide most of the time. So they should be sharing information probably the most. And because everything there is not everything, but a lot of the crime is gang related because of turf wars with drugs. It was really important that gang piece be in there. So having everyone in the same room, I think was helpful. And I think they heard some things and they realized, oh, there's parts of my pieces fit into the rest of the puzzle too.
Yeah, the shootings, we used to chalk some of those up to John Hopkins being so good at their job, right? That's why you had a shooting and not a homicide.
Yeah.
So you eventually move on to Scottsdale, and I want to get into that. But I first have to say that this is where you and I's paths do not cross directly, but you certainly influenced my career, because with you leaving, I replace you at Baltimore Police Department at the Washington Baltimore HIDA. And you were talking about the director of HIDA. I was an intern there that summer. It was 2001. And went to Tom Carr, who's the director, and asked him if he had any jobs. And there was two. There was the one that you had just vacated in Baltimore PD. And then there was another one in DC with the DEA. Well, I applied for both. I interviewed for both. I ended up taking the Baltimore job mainly because of location. I lived downtown Baltimore. I actually walked to work while I was there.
Wow.
But it's, you kind of go back and you kind of think of what might have been had you not moved on when you did. I would have probably taken that DC DEA job. So
wow,
it's just funny. And you talked about Eric Konahia. I mean, for those that don't know him, he's Hawaiian, but he always has this like frown on his face. So the first time that I met him, I was so intimidated. I thought, oh my gosh, what am I getting myself into? But obviously you get to know him, and he's a great guy. And it's just, we became pretty good friends. But I just remember the first time meeting him, I'm like, man, that guy seems pretty rough and stern.
I had the exact same impression. And the first time I met him was my first day there at work. And he always kind of has this like very serious look on his face. And he looks like he's really mad. But he's like, once you know him, he's hilarious. He's probably one of the funniest people I've ever met. And he makes fun of everyone. And the first day he said to me, he's like, where do you live? And I told him where I lived. And he's like, yeah, you're on my way. So you and I are going to carpool. And I was like, okay. And he's like, give me your address. And I'm like, okay. And he's giving my address. And he's like, I'll pick you up at 6:30 in the morning or whatever time it was. And I'm like, all right. We started driving to work together, and he became a really good friend of mine. He was he was really funny and a great guy and a wealth of information. He taught me a lot. And I think I was telling you before about how he had told me at one point there, he's like, when we go into a meeting that you have to stand at attention and when anyone who's a major or above walks into the room. And I'm like, nah. And he's like, yes. And I'm like, I think you're just messing with me. And he's like, no. And we're going to this meeting later today. And I just wanted to make sure, you're aware. So we go to this meeting later, and one of the majors walks in the room, and someone yells, attention. And everyone like jumps up and stands at attention. They walk in, they say, Eddie's, and I was like, oh my gosh, he wasn't kidding. So I was like, so I never knew whether to not to take him seriously, because sometimes he'd tell me stuff and then I come into work expecting something to happen. It would never happen, or I'd do something stupid because he told me, well, this is how you do it. And I'd start to do it. I realized no one else was doing that. I'm like, I'd be looking at him, he'd be like, ha ha, so
Gotcha.
He had a lot of fun at my expense. So
yeah, man, the CompStat meetings that I was part of, every once in a while, the mayor would walk in and then everybody's jumping up for the mayor. mayor. And not knowing anything, being my first career, I just thought that was normal. The mayor would walk into a ComStat meeting. From what I've talked to over the years, that was very rare for the mayor to be involved in a police ComStat or planning meeting like that.
It's never happened here. When I first started working at Scottsdale, I remember asking my supervisor and one of my coworkers, I was like, oh, okay. And, like, what is the dress code? And they said, business. And I was like, okay, so I wear a suit to work every day. And they're, because that's what I had to wear in Baltimore. And they're like, no, like, okay, so I guess like business casual. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I asked, I think my second question was, and at what level of command rank and above do we stand at attention? And they both just looked at me. I'm like, what? And I'm like, so I obviously, like, if the chief of police walks into the room, we stand at attention, but like, how much lower than that do you guys go? And they're like, we don't stand at attention for anyone. Like, and my boss started laughing and he said, I forget that you're coming from the East Coast. He said, I think policing on the East Coast is much more militaristic than it is on the West Coast. And that's definitely true. So yes. It's much more a relaxed environment. My coworker was like, our chief comes in here sometimes like right after working out and he's in gym clothes or he's in flip-flops and a t-shirt and he'll ask you for info. And I was like, oh, really? Okay. Yeah, that would never happen in Baltimore. So
yeah, no, it is interesting how there's just a certain behavior or a certain tendency of all these different police departments, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's a different culture, but I have to say, like, my time in Baltimore was great. We had a lot of fun. The crime was really interesting. Like I know that's
a lot of it.
Sounds bad. There was a lot of it. Yeah. There was a lot of violent crime. I remember on my oral board here for Scottsdale, one of the sergeants that was on the oral board after it was over, he said, can I ask a question that's not on the list? And that always scares, the other people that are sitting there a little bit. And I was like, oh, sure. He's like, so your examples, like from your previous job were really great. And you talked about, sex assault series, you talked about homicides, you talked about shooting cases, robberies, different things that you worked on and solved and put together. And great. But if the worst thing that happens in North Scottsdale is that someone leaves their garage door open and their golf clubs get stolen, are you going to be incredibly bored here?
That was a serious question, right?
Yeah. And I was like, oh, no, there's patterns in burglary that you can look into, and there's still ways, look at crime and link things together through MO, regardless of whether it's persons or property crime. So, we are fortunate in Scottsdale that we have a lot more. It's more property crimes. We don't have violent crimes very often, but we've had our share of some strange cases here too. So
you moved back to Scottsdale, as you mentioned. I want you to tell the story of how you got there, because your father had a pretty big influence on getting you the job at Scottsdale.
Yes. So I knew I wanted to move back to Arizona. And so I had come out to visit my parents, and the director of the HIDA in Baltimore had set me up with an interview, the director down in Tucson. And so I'd driven down there, and my dad was really excited that I was looking for jobs in Arizona, because the entire time I was in Maryland, he was cutting little newspaper articles out of the paper and sending me different job possibilities. Oh, I saw a job for you today. He told me, I cut it out of the paper and I sent you all the information so you can send them your resume. And I'm like, okay, Dad, I get these little articles in the mail with, they're hiring a criminalist at the PD. And I'd have to explain to my dad, I'm not a chemistry major. I'm not qualified for this position. And so every time he saw something, he'd be sending it to me. But I'm down in Tucson doing this interview. I'm driving back up to Phoenix, and this guy calls me and he's like, hi, is this Mary? And I said, yes. And he's like, my name's Jim, and I'm a background investigator for the Scottsdale Police Department. And the chief of police came in and put your resume on my desk and said I should give you a call. And I'm like, oh, okay. Hi. And he's like, I don't really know what it's about, but he said something about like, maybe I could introduce you to our Crime Analysis Supervisor. And do you have time to come in and meet with me today? And I'm like, sure. Just tell me where you're located. And I hang up the phone and I call my dad and I said, did you give my resume or send my resume into the Scottsdale Police Department? And he's like, oh, yeah, about that. I was meaning to tell you. I went down there with your resume and I met with the chief and I gave him your resume. And I'm like, what? How did you do that? Like, and he's like, well, I just went in and to headquarters and I asked to speak with the chief and they said, what is this pertaining to? And I said it was a private matter. And they said, oh, okay, just a minute. And then he said, like 5 minutes later, I'm in this elevator and it has a doors that open in the front and then these doors that open in the back, and it took me up to the second floor and then the back doors open and you go out and I'm in this other office. And he said, and then they took me in and I met with the chief and I gave him your resume and he was very impressed. And so if there's a job that opens up, he said he'd definitely consider you for it, but they don't have anything right now. I was like, and like rewind to where like you walked in and said you want to talk to the chief and they let you. Like, who does this? So,
my.
but if you knew my dad, he's not alive anymore, but he had a big, huge personality and he's very gregarious, never met a stranger, and he can make friends with anyone. And that was him. He wanted to get me here so badly. And his reasoning was too, I think at the time there's also a position open at Glendale PD. And I had been applying for that too. And he was telling me, Glendale and Scottsdale are competing over who's going to get the stadium, all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, Dad, who cares? And he's like, well, they're very competitive, the two cities, because of the whole stadium issue. So Scottsdale knows that Glendale might want to hire you to be a crime analyst, then maybe they'll want to hire you to be a crime analyst. So like, I don't think it works that way, but thanks. So I ended up coming in here into Scottsdale PD and asking to speak with the background investigator. And he introduced me to the supervisor of the crime analysis unit, who was Paul Bentley. And Paul was so nice to me. And I, I'm shaking my head. I'm like, my dad, I'm so embarrassed,
I would have been mortified.
Yes, I was. My dad, I'm sorry. I'm trying to like explain it. And he just laughed. He said, oh, don't worry about it. Parents do things sometimes. He just is looking out for you. And he was so gracious and so nice about it. He looked up through my resume and he asked me a lot of questions. He ended up, we talked for quite a while. He said we are going to be hiring hopefully soon. He said, I've asked to get this position, another position, and it's going to be for a tactical analyst. And he's like, I'm looking at your resume and talking with you. He said, it sounds like you might be a good fit for this because of your intelligence background, and working on that is kind of, some of those skills are transferable. He's like, how was your mapping skills? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm not good at that. I said, I've got 6 guys in the back who make really pretty maps. I said, I can do some basic stuff. And I said, we use map info. And he's like, oh, well, we use, ArcGIS. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't have any experience. I said, but I do pick up software pretty quickly. So I'm sure I can learn how to do it. To tell you the truth, that's one area where my skills aren't real sharp. So he's like, oh, I can appreciate that. And he's like, well, what would you say was your biggest strength? I said, actually, networking. I said, I'm really good at meeting people and getting to know more about them and what their strengths are. I said, and learning from different people. And I said, and in this business, it's important to be able to call on other people to help you and to be able to assist you. And he's like, oh, that's, I've never had anyone say that. So anyway, I guess it kind of stuck with him. And when they ended up probably about 3 months later, he sent me an email and said, oh, we're going to be opening this position, so look for it. As soon as it opened, I ended up applying for it and getting the position. And it's been almost 19 years and I'm still here.
Oh, wow. Yep. Not getting rid of you anytime soon, right?
Right.
So was there a downshift like the one officer was thinking, that, okay, you went from high-paced Baltimore to maybe a little slower in Scottsdale? Did you experience that?
I definitely went through like violence withdrawal. I'd have to say. I'd say I'd worked here for about a month, and I remember calling Eric in Baltimore and going, so how many homicides have you guys had this year? He's like, oh, I can't give you that information. It's classified. He's giving me a hard time. I said, no, it's not. Just tell me. Come on. And he's like, I don't know. We're at, 15 or something like that. I'm like, wow, 15 homicides. Cool. He's like, how many have you had? I'm like, none. And he's like, oh. I said, how many shootings have you had? And he's like, oh, I don't know. Stand by. And he, looks and he's like, oh, we've had like 50 or something like that. And I'm like, wow, cool. He's like, what about you? I'm like, none. And he's like, oh, girl, what are they paying you to do out there? And I was like, burglary. We do a lot of burglary. It was a transition to go to the slower pace, but we did get really interesting cases. I worked on some really big cases here, and one that lasted a really long time, which was the Rock Burglary series. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but that was a big case. It went on for so long is what happened with it. And it was just an interesting case.
What was the basics of the case?
It was a burglary series that went on actually before I started. They had some going back to, I think, like 97. I remember the lieutenant coming in and saying, hey, we've had a bunch of residential burglaries where the subject is taking a river rock and throwing it through the master bathroom or master bedroom window. It's usually they were doing it to fixed window, so it doesn't open or close, so it's not alarmed. So no alarm would be going off. So then the burglar would have time to get in the house, and they'd stay strictly in the master bedroom and just take nice jewelry, cash, guns, and sometimes an expensive purse or something like that. The homeowners are almost always on vacation. He's like, would you be interested in working on this case? And we're going to probably start a task force because it's not only happening in Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, which is our neighbor just to the west of us, and then the northern part of Scottsdale in an area called Carefree in the county. Our three cities were getting hit pretty hard. Usually happen over the weekend. And so people would leave on Thursday or Friday, and then they come home on Monday and their house would have been broken into. And sometimes their alarm was set and it just never went off because they were entering through this fixed window. But other times there would be, the alarm would go off. And so we'd have an exact time. And it was always usually around between midnight and 3 a.m. So these homes are huge, mansions. There's a lot of desert around it. There's not a lot of neighbors. And so a lot of times people would hear a window break at their neighbor's house, especially not in the middle of the night. So when I started on it was in 2002. And I can't remember all the details now because it's been a while since I looked at it, but the series went on till about 2007, and then it really stopped. We didn't see any for a long time. And then I'd say several years later, the county started to have some, but in a different part of the county and not up in the Carefree area. It was over in Fountain Hills, started to have some burglaries that seemed very similar. One of the sergeants there, the burglary sergeant, he ended up calling our burglary sergeant, and our burglary sergeant said, well, what did your crime analyst tell you about it? And he's like, well, we don't have a crime analyst. And so he's like, well, call my crime analyst then, she'll help you. So the sergeant ended up calling me, and we talked, and I said, oh yeah, it does kind of sound like a rock burglar. And we went through their cases and did some analysis on it. But there were some things about it that were kind of different. And when we looked at some of the houses, it didn't seem necessarily the same, but they kept working on it, and I'd done some analysis on it, and they ended up catching someone and getting DNA off of them. And we had probably about a handful of cases where we had DNA, like he cut himself going through the window, and another one, like he leaned forward on the window and he left sweat on the window, and they were able to get DNA out of the sweat. Another one, he dropped a flashlight, and we'd had the flashlight impounded in evidence for years. And one of the MCSO detectives said, did you ever test the end of the flashlight for DNA? Because he said, I know when I'm busy in my car, I'm trying to look for something. He said, I stick my flashlight in my mouth and I hold it so I can use both hands to go through my bag and look for whatever I'm looking for. And he said, so maybe he's doing the same thing. And so they tested it, and sure enough, they got DNA years later off the handle from saliva. When they arrested this guy, it ended up coming back to hit on we had put one of our lieutenants our property crimes lieutenant at the time had put a warrant in for that DNA profile. So in case it ever hit on something, it would come back, but it kind of preserved our cases, because some of these cases were so old that by the time we were going back through it, the statute of limitations would have run out on some of these burglary charges. So we were able to charge him eventually with a bunch of burglaries that had happened throughout the years in 3 different jurisdictions. So it was a really interesting case. And I did a presentation with, at the time he was the burglary sergeant, but now he's a commander here. And then the prosecutor. We did a presentation for the Arizona Association of Crime Analysts, where we all 3 talked about the case and the different roles that we played in it and how everything got tied together. And he ended up serving, I can't remember how many years, but he was older by the time they caught him, and he had some health issues, and he ended up dying not too long after he had been sentenced.
How do you think he was able to avoid detection for so long?
Yeah. So we used a lot of different techniques. So one of the things that I did when I was working on that was we had Bear software products at that time, and Sean Bear and Dan Helms, they were both from Arizona, so they knew about this case too. And so they had helped us and had made some suggestions. And Dan Helms taught me how to do a lag variogram with all the hits. And he described it as there's a way to kind of identify what the hunting grounds are like and which hunting ground they're going to hit in based on people just naturally have patterns in their behavior. So I ran a lag variogram on all the data, and I found that like every fifth hit, we would have a predictable place to go. So I would start to go, we should focus on this area because this will probably be our next target. The only problem was that the areas were so big, the hunting grounds, and this is all like desert and, it's pitch black out there. But we did a lot of surveillances based off of where we thought they were going to hit. But one of the things that I think he admitted to this later is that they had some kind of he wouldn't talk about who helped him with it. Like, I don't think he ever admitted that. We knew he had to have someone who was helping him, but I think he was using like a police scanner. And so then we were trying to stay off of channels, but I think he was just so adept to being out in the desert at night. If he noticed anything that was off, because you can't get a bunch of cops in one area. And yeah. I think he'd sometimes know we were coming and he wouldn't hit. He'd skip that weekend. And he just said he would notice things. And he said he set up stuff at the houses to make sure people weren't home. Things like, taking their newspaper and leaning it up against the garage door so he could come back later. And if the garage door had moved and the newspaper had fallen down, he knew that someone had come and gone in that house. So he didn't want to hit it. So most of the time it's like their garbage can was out. But it seemed like he always knew if we were in one area and he'd end up hitting a different area. And one of the other things I had suggested with that was that we use I said, a lot of these places are out. He's hiked to get there, like, because there was no car. Like, we'd never seen any evidence of a car, but we'd see evidence that someone had sat out behind a tree behind the house for quite a while. And we'd sometimes see shoe prints where we knew he'd gone over a wall to get into the backyard. And so I said, if we ever get an alarm call, we should have a canine unit that's on standby. If the canine unit can respond fast enough, that dog would be able to track him down the wash and potentially catch him before he can get back to his vehicle, because we knew that he had to be hiking into some of these locations that he was hitting. So, I was the only female on the task force, and I was the only like non-sworn person. Actually, I take it back. There was one other analyst that would sometimes come from the county. My lieutenant's like, yeah, Mary, canines. You're just, you're focused on the canines. You like dogs, whatever. And so we had it set up. We had the canine unit out this one holiday weekend, and we get an alarm call, and it's the area where we thought he was going to be hitting, but these are huge areas. The canine unit responds, but they get it's up there. The streets are kind of twisty turning. There's a lot of dead ends. He ends up getting delayed. And it's like, now he's getting there about 30 minutes after the alarm call. So he takes the dog out, and the dog goes nuts behind the house, circles this tree a lot. And the officer's looking, he's like, I can see that someone sat out behind this tree. Like, the earth is all disturbed. He said, I can see the dog's like sniffing up over the wall, runs along the wall, sniffs down this other area, and then takes off, dragging him down this trail, about a mile down this wash, under a little bridge out to where this little road crosses. And the dog goes up on the other side of the bridge and stops. Like, he told me later, he said, I have no doubt that's where he parked his car. And he got back in. He said, so that he was there and the dog tracked him. He said, if I would have been able to get there faster, he said, I got some digits confused on the address, I think is what it was. And he ended up going to a different house, which was the wrong house. He said, if I would have been just a little bit faster, he said, my dog was so hot on that trail. He said, I think we could have caught up with him unless he was literally running, the whole time. I was like, oh, well, maybe next time.
Yeah, we eventually got him. So good.
Yeah, we did.
I just want to ask one final question about Scottsdale, because I had Sally Rawlings on the show. Because she does so much training and travels around the country, I asked her what crime analysis units were in her top 3 for the United States. And she ranked Scottsdale as number 1. So I just wanted to get your perspective of what makes Scottsdale different.
Well, that's a really phenomenal compliment. And I appreciate Sally saying that. I actually agree with her. I think we have a great unit. We have a great department. Well, I think there's a couple things. Our culture's shifted a lot over the years. And I think a lot of the people, like I've been here, I've been in this position for a long time. And a lot of the people that when I started, they were detectives or sergeants, and now they've worked their way up and they're lieutenants and commanders and assistant chiefs. They've seen all the different things that our analysts can do and how versatile we are, and how I'm big on training. I'm trying to make sure that even when they cut our budgets, that we've been through several, downturns in the economy where a lot of budgets get cut. I've lost my training budget. In fact, I just usually work on that I'm not going to have much of a training budget. So I really try to get training to come here because at least we do have a good facility for hosting training. So I've hosted a lot of training. The IACA provides a ton of training. We've had the IACA series, like the whole in-person class series out here before. So a lot of training and trying to stay on top of the trends. And I encourage all my analysts to look for free trainings in the area, to try to bring trainings here. If they see something at a conference or working with other analysts that other analysts are using that we're not, like, what are they doing? How does it work? Would it work for us? That type of thing. So just always trying to adapt and learn as much as possible. I think that's it. And I try to make sure everyone goes to the IACA conference every year, because I just think that networking and the support that our association provides us as analysts, as individuals, is invaluable. So I think it's just kind of a culture of learning and just open to new possibilities and meeting new people and anything that could be new or useful. A part of it too is that we have to adapt to what our agency needs at the time. And in the last, I want to say, gosh, it's been a little over, I think, 4 years now that the crime analysis used to be housed under the Administrative Services Bureau, and now we're under Investigative Services. And they combined our intel and our crime analysis unit. So we do both. My crime analysts, who started as crime analysts, really embraced learning how to do intel analysis, and the same, like vice versa with my intel analysts. They have learned how to do more crime analysis stuff, and everyone has kind of their strengths. And I really try to help play to those strengths as much as I can while still trying to get people to learn new things. But my team's very involved in both our regional association and in our international association and in IALEA as well. One of the guys who works for me is the vice president for IALEA.
Who's that?
Chris Henningsen.
Okay.
One of my other analysts, Kelsey Cohen, she took the certification for IALEA and passed that, which is really difficult to do. And then Mike Winslow and Brittany Willis have both worked for me for a long time, and they're both very involved in the IACA and teaching classes there and being involved in working on committees and just being really involved.
All right. Well,
That's
good.
it, like networking and using our association.
Very good. All right. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into IACA and talk different aspects of the IACA. This is Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back. Hi, this is Jason Elder and Mindy Hune from LEA Podcasts. Mindy, how many people voted in last year's IACA election?
Probably around 10 to 11%.
Wow. Is that normal?
It's the unfortunate trend.
Wow. What can we do to wreck that trend?
I think we should start by recommending to 10 of our friends, members with the association, and ask them to recommend to 10 of their friends to start voting and getting involved, and we'll go from there.
That sounds like a pyramid scheme.
It is. But it's a good pyramid scheme. It's for a good cause.
All right, so we're going to reach out to 10 friends of ours that are members of the IACA, encourage them to vote, and then ask them to reach out to 10 of their friends to do the same. We're going to recommend 10, and this is going to wreck the trend.
Exactly.
All right, so how do you vote?
You can vote on the IACA website at iaca.net/IACA-election-page.
But I think I already voted in September.
During September, it was just the nomination phase. Now that we're in October, the entire month of October is actually the voting phase. So if you only voted in September, go again to vote, because the vote in September does not transfer over to October.
Well, what if I don't know the candidates?
On that voting page, you can find information on both our candidates. You can find more information on them via the IACA website, the forums, or if you're fans of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder, you can find information on them on leapodcast.com with an S.
Well, what about those that think that their vote doesn't matter?
It does matter, and if we looked at last year's, it was very close. That one vote could have made a difference. We're all in this association together. It's important that we have a voice in choosing our next leader. And if you have been a fan of our podcast, a lot of our guests have mentioned that IACA is like a second family. And when you're a part of the family, like, you're important. Your voice needs to be heard. So please vote.
All right. So you heard it. Rec 10, wreck the trend. So reach out to 10 of your friends, IACA members. You probably haven't talked to them all year anyway. reach out to them, encourage them to vote, and let's wreck this trend. Thank you. Welcome back. As you heard in the break, if you're an IACA member, please consider voting. We are trying to get the voter turnout up with our Rec 10, Rec the Trend event. I guess, Mary, why do you think the voter turnout is so low?
I honestly don't know, because I'm always voting and, and obviously I'm involved. I think part of it is that maybe people are just they're content with what we're doing and assume it's all going to continue on and everything will be just fine. I would love to have people be more engaged and to give us more feedback on, what they want from the association, what they need from the association. And one of the best ways to do it is to kind of vet your candidates and listen to what they think, see if your beliefs align with theirs, and vote for the person who you think is going to be best able to represent you.
Yeah, good. Actually, before we get into more of the IAC, I do have a question for you. How do you describe crime analysis to folks?
I describe crime analysis as looking for patterns and trends in your crimes and trying to find the similarities in MO or location and match those crimes. And I also describe our profession as a whole as being, analysts who are really able to network with others and make those links and help to put cases together. And we help the detective solve crimes, and we help police prevent crime by getting them in the right area in time to be able to prevent crime from actually occurring, or to catch people in the act, like if you've got a series. So do a lot of presentations to younger kids. I describe it a little bit differently. And when I describe it to little kids, I describe it as it's almost like playing a game of Go Fish, where you call another analyst or you reach out to another analyst and say, I have this and this and this. Do you have any of that happening? And if they do, then you guys collect the cards and you work on it together. And if not, then you kind of go to the next agency and see what you can get. But making those links between crimes.
Yeah, I just steal their stuff, right? And go fish and just steal their stuff.
Yeah.
Good. So as I mentioned in your introduction, you've worked on a lot of IACA conferences. Do you have a favorite?
I don't know. It's hard. I don't know that I do have a favorite, because I have favorite memories from so many different places over the years. Because of the city, they're all kind of a little bit different. I love Louisville. That was one of our lower attended ones, but I love the city, and the events that we had there were great. And I felt like I met some new people. Part of it too for me is that I've worked on the conference committee for so long. When you're working on the conference committee, you never get to attend classes. I don't know if I had to name, and I like New Orleans too.
Yeah, that's a great location.
And New Orleans, and we've been there twice. So one was the year after Katrina, I think maybe that was 2006. And then again in 2017. That was a good conference, and we had a good turnout. And the one in 2006, we stayed after to do an event with Habitat for Humanity. And that was really fun. And I met a lot of new people who I became a lot closer with just because we stayed and we worked on that project together.
I'd like to see the conference do that every year, put together some kind of volunteer event, whether people join or not, at least try to put it together for the association to give back.
Yeah, and we've talked about doing that too. And I know we always usually tried to do a raffle and give money to a charity, have the proceeds go to a charity that someone within our association feels strongly about that year. So I know some years we've done it for fallen officers, because there's been an officer that, like something that happened in that city where we felt like it was important to contribute. Other times we've done it for more personal illness, breast cancer, or there was another one where we were working with, I want to say it was like a disease that had affected someone's child, and someone's child in our association had passed away from that. We gave to that charity one year too. So we try and do that every year, but I agree. I like doing the actual volunteer event. One of our vendors had brought that up too, that they had worked on something at another conference, and where they had set up like tables and had everyone get together and assemble like boxes with goods that had been donated to hand out. We had talked about maybe trying to set something like that up at our next conference, but the Chicago conference we had to cancel. So So that didn't happen, but it might be something that we try and do for next year in Las Vegas.
I look forward to it. Hopefully we'll get there, right?
Yes.
So you become president after not ever serving on the IACA board. When I look back at what you inherited or what was going on with the IACA when you became president, if you look at the different presidencies back to 94, Mark Stallo serves 2 terms, Noah Fritz serves 2 terms, Christopher Bruce serves 2 terms, and then Susan Whitford, she doesn't finish her first term, and then Carolyn Cassidy only does a partial term, and then Noah Fritz again serves just a partial term, and same thing with Jim Mallard, for all various reasons, of course, of why they didn't serve complete 1 term, let alone serve 2 terms. But just talk a little bit about coming in as president with all that inconsistency that's happened over the last couple of years and not being on the board, of just how you managed getting acclimated to the presidency.
Well, one of the things that was helpful for me when I first transitioned onto the board was that because the way the system is staggered, the way the elections and the board members are staggered, you always have someone on the board that has been working on the board already. So they're already kind of established and they're kind of into the routine, and they kind of work to help catch you up with things. Like I had some certain things that I wanted to make sure that we addressed that I thought were important for the IAC, for the members. So when we met for the first time, I came on and then we all got to talk about what we felt was important and tried to agree on some priority, but because there's so many things that we do already, and then there's so many things that we would like to do. So you just kind of have to prioritize, and some things just automatically, because they're urgent, take precedence. So when I came on, we were really trying to get the website fully functional and running, and we made that transition to the new website with the new company that had been designing it for us. And then, of course, whenever you do something new and huge like that, there's a lot of issues that have to be dealt with. So I think part of it was that some of the board members that had already been there for a while, they were able to really help me understand the history of some of the various projects that were in progress. All the board members have different committees that they're kind of the board liaison with that committee. So when I first came on, I just took the 2 ones that the previous president had. And I was like, I don't know a lot about technology. I don't think I know a lot about technology. And Adrienne, she was the secretary at the time. And she's like, oh, well, you don't really need to, because Manny San Pedro is over the technology committee and he understands. I'm like, oh, okay, good. Well, as long as no one's looking for me to make those types of decisions. When you're in a board position, you're relying on pretty much the committee chairs, because they've been working in that area for a while and they're familiar with all the nuances of what's occurring and what needs to be done. And you just are trying to kind of manage them then and say, okay, well, you tell me what your biggest priorities are and how we can get there. And I'll try and smooth that path so that it happens for you. So that's basically what we've been doing. And so the staggered system I like, because I was able to have that help. And then the same thing when the new person came on after me, we were able to, the existing board members were able to assist her in her role transitioning. Adrienne she was just so organized, and it's hard to believe that there's another person out there that's as organized as Adrienne is, but Kristen Lottman is spectacular. She's also very organized and she has some great ideas. And that's one of the things that I really like about the staggered positions, is that you always have someone new coming in to give you new ideas and to say, hey, what about this? And you're like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Where does that fit in our list of priorities?
And that's Adrienne, is it Galbraith?
Yes.
Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, so the staggered system, when I had Christopher Bruce on about a month or so ago, he was talking about that he didn't like that aspect of the staggering, because before this, for those that don't know, everybody on the board got elected at the same time. So you were more or less a cohort. Because you were that one unit that all came on at the same time. In his eyes, more unity. And I even remember that as going to the conference, and at the end of the business meeting, when it was announced who won, there was that picture that they took with all of them together, showing that unity of the board, which I'm not sure if there's even a photo with all of you guys together anymore or not. That was one thing I understood what he was talking about, but I do see the advantage of what you're saying with it helped you from not being on the board previously, that those who are currently on the board helped you along.
Yeah, I see some of the benefits of looking at it like a one cohesive unit that comes on and you're all working together for that same period of time. I can see the benefit of that and how that will be good. The one problem I can see with that is when you have a board that transitions out and a brand new board's coming in, if they've never been, in a board position before, that's a huge learning curve to just put on new people and go, here you go.
Yeah.
They used to do like a transition, but I know like in my situation, the previous president couldn't come to that meeting to do the transition. So I was happy that the existing board members that were there were able to do that. And I think we had one previous board member that he came to help the new treasurer transition into the role. So unless your old board and your new board are going to be able to commit to making that transition really smooth, I think this allows for a smoother process going along throughout the years. Like you're not going to have as much disruption because you're going to still know the people that are continuing on the board are going to still know what your priorities were. We had a plan and this is where we were steering the ship. Mm-hmm. And the new person's going to come on and go, hey, I like where we're steering. I like the goal that we're headed towards. But have you ever thought that there was a little island off over here that might be worth exploring too? And then everyone can go, hey, yeah, that is. And you know what? That island we might miss the boat on that if we don't explore that island right now. So we can kind of reshift your priorities if you need to, or you can go, yeah, like maybe we can hit that island on the way back, but we're going to stay on the course that we're on. And you guys are going to talk about that as a board and decide on it. And I don't see the staggering as being a bad thing or that you've got that things become stagnant or anything, because you're kind of going along and you've got the new people bringing in the new ideas, but you've got the existing board saying, let's stay on course and remember this was where we were headed. If that makes sense.
It does. I think it's interesting because I used to have a former president as an advisor to the board. And I think that might actually have been a board position at one point in time, but we got rid of it because they didn't think it was needed. But you do need somebody to hand you the torch.
And on some of our previous boards, there had been some drama and personalities that didn't get along. That transition might not always happen so smoothly. If you're sending all these brand new people in to be president, 2 vice presidents, a secretary, and a treasurer, those 5 brand new people, here go, Yeah.
Let's talk about the state of the association, some things that are working well and some things that need to be improved or you'd like to see improved.
This year has been rough and not typical in anything. And it's a hard question to answer just because we had to make so many changes in how we meet and and that's just not even with IACA, and this is just in life in general. Like, everything came to a standstill and doing things in person came to a standstill. I would say so. One of the things that posed the greatest challenge for us was how do we transition to this virtual world where you're not allowed to meet in person anymore. And it impacted obviously our training conference. It impacted our training and it had a lot of impact. And those are 2 big parts of our association that the members are getting a big benefit out of. Our conference committee, they're incredible, just consummate professionals. So is the training committee, the conference committee, that they had a big impact on them this year. And the whole board, we met a lot earlier in the year trying to make decisions and trying to figure out if this is something that we could ride out or if we were going to have to really make some big changes and cancel our conference and rework that contract. And there were so many moving pieces and parts. And Kyle Stoker, who's over our training, he really stepped up and just knocked it out of the park with helping the conference committee go, here's how we can do a virtual conference. And we decided to take some of the people who had already put in to present at the conference, to kind of tweak how we did the calls for presentations and say, hey, would you be willing to do this in the form of a webinar instead of in person? And how would your content work? And everyone really stepped up and came together. In terms of the current state, we're still kind of in a process where we're trying to navigate how things are going to go in the future. But I can say that I think it's going really well in terms of the training. We've had so many more training classes and online conference, the virtual conference. That's been really well attended. I can't remember how many countries. It was like 36 countries or something crazy that came on for the conference webinars. all the online training that we've had, and we were really still able to provide a lot of features that our members are wanting and needing from us. And we've been able to kind of transition to doing it in this virtual format. So I think we've really done well in that respect. Kyle, when you had him on your show, he talked about the IACA's webinar library. Have you looked at that? There's like 75 different webinars there, and not all in English, they're in Spanish. And that's another thing too. Rachel coming on and being from another country outside the United States, she brought in and kind of said, hey, how can we get more international members, people outside of the United States involved in things? And she's been great. And we've increased the number of Spanish language webinars. We're talking about trying to do our certification test in other languages. There's a lot of big things on the horizon for us as an association in terms of trying to expand, draw in more international members. And I know Sally Rawlings, she's the chairperson over the mentoring committee, and she's working with some more of our international members to try and bring in more international mentors and mentees, people who are looking to be mentored from other countries as well. So she's trying to harness some of the people from outside of our country, like in Brazil and Mexico, and she's reaching out with them and trying to say, hey, how do we make this better? I think in some aspects, it's been hard because it's almost like we've been on pause
The
for
great pause.
a while. Yes, but in other aspects, we've been scrambling and working so hard behind the scenes to make sure all that training was there. And we sat through different webinar contents and like webinars on how to host virtual conferences. And I know Kyle sat through like an entire day-long webinar on virtual webinars just to see what other systems were out there. He reported back, gave us this like long detailed report and all the pros and cons, and everything was so well organized. I read through it. I was like, oh my gosh, wow. The committees for the IACA do so much. It's mind boggling how much work is getting done. And we're all volunteers. Like that's the thing, is that we're all doing this on a volunteer basis. And the work that's being done is phenomenal.
In terms of the international outreach, one of the things I would like to see is actually the chair of the IOC be a board member, to ensure that there's an international influence on the board. We have Rachel now, but we don't always have an international representation on the board.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We should talk about that, Jason.
At the next board meeting.
I like
right?
that idea. Yes, at the next board meeting. It is something that we've talked about, how to get more international representation on the board and how to guarantee that that's there. And I think like our IOC, our International Outreach Committee, it's huge. One of the things, like if you go on our website now, we've got a page just completely dedicated to the committees. And if you click on all the different committees, you can see all the people that are on there and how to contact, the committee chairperson for everything. That was one of our goals when I first came on, was I wanted to make sure that was much more apparent to the members, like how to become involved if you want to become involved. Because I think there was a lot of times where I had people ask me like, how do I become involved in this? And I was like, oh, well, if you email the person who's over that committee, and they're like, well, how do you know who that person is? And I'm like, I know because I know, but I don't know if it's on the website. But so that was one of the things I wanted to make sure that all of that was on the website. And Manny did a good job of getting all of that really like fleshed out, people's pictures up there, so that it was much more of like you could put a face with the name and you're like, oh yeah, I know that person. I didn't know that they were on that committee or over the chairperson of that committee. Like that's okay. I can email that person, or now you meet them at a conference like the next year or something, and you're like, oh, I've been talking to you via email and I recognized you from across the room and now I'm going to talk to you in person. So I think that can happen more easily now because we've got it all out there. But that IOC committee is huge, and we've got some really good people that are working on that. And I know the board's talked about different ideas on how we could do that. Should we have a second board that's just all international members, and how would that work? And would that divide us? But what you just said about having maybe one person that's assigned, that might actually be a good idea, and that might work. So I just have to think about how we would implement that.
Yeah, the logistics, I'm sure it was there, how it would be defined, and just like anything else, because I'm sure.
And how we transition that position too, like
sure, and it'd have to be elected position to be on the board. So I'm sure there's a lot of
I mean, we'd have to figure all of that out with bylaws.
Yeah.
And that would probably require a bylaw change, which that's another thing. I know Kristen Lotman, our secretary, has been working with some people who are reviewing the bylaws, because there's a lot of things in our bylaws, they don't match with the charter. And then when something comes up, we've got to figure out, oh, well, the charter says this, but the bylaws say that. And does that really work together? Like we have to figure that out. So we have people that are reviewing that, and that's just a very tedious, labor intensive project. So, but that's been ongoing. We've had a lot of big projects that have just been, they're slow moving, but they're progressing forward. For a volunteer organization, that's all you can ask, is that you kind of keep going. Sometimes, you can't drop everything to work on stuff. Like I could spend 30, 40 hours a week just doing IACA stuff easily. And like when I first started in this position, man, I tell you, I didn't sleep. I didn't sleep a lot. Like I would work at my regular job and I'd come home and take care of my daughter. And the second she was in bed, from like 9 to midnight or 1 a.m, I was working on just IACA stuff and reading through things and trying to get to where I understood things, how things worked a little bit better, or working out ideas. Like I'd have an idea for something and I'd kind of like try to flesh everything out and go, oh, if we do that, we'd need to do X, Y, Z to get us there. And so it gets to where it's a little bit easier. But I know there was a learning curve at first, and we could be doing a lot more, but we've got to take your top priorities and work on those first. But there's so many good ideas out there, and there's lots of things that we could do. And we've expanded our committees a lot to try and get more things done.
Is that it? Do you feel overall that we need more volunteers with the IACA?
Maybe on some of our committees. I know the ones that I have right now, I've asked, like, are you fully staffed? Can you do what you have set out to do with the people that you have right now? Mentoring asked to be bumped up, and we did that. Training has asked to have an extra position added, and we've done that because Kyle wanted to work on transcribing all of our webinars so that we could actually put them into other languages and people could view it in whatever language they want to watch it in. So we're working on that. And technology has had some different ideas with things, and we've said, okay, well, let us know what you need and let's make that happen. If there's a new project that you want to do, like for the website or the forum, then let us know and we'll try and make that happen for you. So we're working on trying to get, like we can't just say, oh yeah, we're just going to add 10 volunteers to every committee to make it better. It still has to be something, because someone still has to manage that, and that falls usually on the committee chairperson. So it's not like you can just arbitrarily add people. You have to add them with purpose. And I want to make sure everyone has direction and knows what they're supposed to be working on. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think the committee chair people do an excellent job of that, and most of them communicate well. And I know we've formed a couple new committees. Annie Mitchell wanted to have a regional association committee that worked with like the IOC committee on like trying to bring in what do the regional associations here need and how can they help the VP of membership processing a lot of those group memberships that we have, and also how does that transition into like IOC group memberships. So those committees are working together, and the one thing that amazes me is how everyone just works together really well. And I don't know if it's something that's inherent in our personalities as analysts, that we're able to kind of go, hey, what's the greater good and how do we work towards that? But I think we all really do a good job of that. At least that's been my experience with the groups that I've been working with here.
Well, very good. No, there is a lot of great work going on, and as you mentioned, it's all volunteer. It's amazing what the association is able to do for its members every day, every year. So very good. Thank you for all that you do for the association and the profession.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate you. You've always been a big supporter of the IACA, and you've been actively involved in the IACA. And I love that you're doing the podcast and you're interviewing different members. And the whole project that you and Mindy have done here has been just really outside the box and different thinking. And I love that. I've listened to almost all of the podcasts that you've done, and it's so interesting. I think I learned something new about everyone. Some of the people I don't know very well, and I've learned obviously lots of new things about them, but a lot of these people I work with and I've known for years and years, and I'm like, I didn't know that about that person. So I found out new things about people that I've known for 18 years now.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate that. Yeah. Same thing. I learn something new every interview, no matter whether I've just met the person or known the person for decades. So Just one last question. I was laughing when you said that in the beginning, when you became president, you were working like 30 hours a week, keeping you up at night. And I said, well, you probably just convinced everybody not to run against you next year. But I guess, is it too early to announce you're running for re-election next year?
Oh, yeah, I don't know yet. I love doing this job. I love all the experiences that we've had, and I've really made close friends with a lot of the board members, and some of them were already friends, but now I'm a lot closer with those people. It's just been a great experience, and I don't know. I guess I haven't thought about it. Part of it because just this year's been 2020 has just been rough on all fronts. Just work has been crazy, insane, and the times that we're living in now are, there's so many people who are anti-police, and it's caused so much division in communities and in the world, and even within families. It's hard. It's been a lot to process. So I wasn't even thinking of that. To tell you the truth, when you brought up the election being next year, I was like, oh my gosh, is it really next year? A lot of things have felt like it's been on pause, but then in a lot of other ways, it's felt like you're fast forwarding because you're trying to just readjust and acclimate to this new virtual everything that you have to do. So it's been a big transitional year, and I think we'll see how it goes next year and what's happening in my life. And because this takes a lot of your personal time. I'd have to say that. I feel like I was very invested in this and trying to make sure everything was working and people were getting value from the IACA, and how was I going to be able to help do that? Obviously, I took that seriously, and I'm trying to make sure that I get out and I'm listening and talking to people about it and trying to get input. But yeah, I'll have to see what next year brings. I'm not giving away any secrets yet.
Okay. I don't get the exclusive. Come on.
I'll call you, Jason.
All right. I expect the call. You better be the first one to know, other than your husband.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So our last segment of the show is Words to the World. And this is where I let the guest have the final say for the program. And you can promote any idea that you want. Mary, what are your words to the world?
Okay, well, my words to the world would be just to be brave in life, in your work, in relationships. A lot of times you're facing things that are new and scary and challenges. And just if in the back of your head, you could just say, be brave and take a deep breath and plow forward, and just, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Well, very good. Well, I leave every guest with, you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later. I do appreciate you being on the show, Mary. Thank you so much. And you take
welcome.
care and be safe.
Thank you. You as well. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Alder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to The Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA Podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.